We all read the same Bible, and that Bible has a book of Philippians in the New Testament. And there are three themes in the letter to the congregation in Philippi, and we call that book the book of the Philippians. And there are three themes. One theme is joy, another theme is unity, and another one is humility. Today I want to talk about one of those three themes, although upon close examination, all three themes are closely related. The theme we're going to cover today is unity. And of course, we may recall the hymnal. In our hymnal, there's a song of Psalm 133, verse 1. Behold, how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Well, let's take a little look at the background of Paul, the Apostle Paul's relationship with the congregation of Philippi. It was a real special congregation for church, for him, because that congregation was the only one of record that Paul mentioned that they sent money to support his work. And they were very helpful for him, and he appreciated it. We learn that in Philippians 4, verse 15. In Philippians 4, verse 15, now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but you only. So you can imagine that Paul had a very personal relationship with the members of the congregation. He spent time there. He knew the individuals. They had a special place in his heart. They were part of his worldly lifeline, as it were. They helped him in his travels, helping finance that. And it was natural for him then to urge them to be strong in their faith. We read then in verse 1 in Philippians 4, therefore, my brethren, dearly beloved and longed for my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord, my dearly beloved. Well, you can imagine how he felt then when two women of the Philippi congregation had a disagreement regarding church matters. He was moved enough to beseech or ask each of them to be of the same mind, to come to an agreement. And we move on into verse 2. He says, I beseech Euodias and beseech Syntyche that they be of the same mind in the Lord. You see, the Apostle Paul asked others to help them. He entreated them. He was earnestly concerned about them. He put it in a letter. He considered them all to be fellow laborers in the work of the gospel. He considered them to be truly converted and to have their names in the book of life. Moving on to verse 3. And I entreat you also, true yokefellow, this is in the King James, help those women which labored with me in the gospel, with Clement also, with my other fellow laborers whose names are in the book of life. So he considered these to be very converted people. And yet for some reason, these two women, Euodias and Syntyche, had a disagreement that was so difficult that even the Apostle Paul, although far away, he heard about it, and he was in prison at the time. Well, this matter then affected Paul enough that he wrote of these attitudes in some of the other letters or epistles, as we call them today. In 1 Corinthians 10, in verse 12, wherefore let him think that he stands, take heed lest he fall. Perhaps we've heard this all our lives in some Bible quotation or another. In fact, there are 29 different references or uses of the word admonishment term, take heed, in the Old Testament, and 26 uses of the phrase, take heed, in the New Testament, or a total of 55 times using that same phrase. So Paul used the analogy of standing and falling as a young child just learning how to walk. And after those few first uncertain steps, a child almost always wound up in a plop on the floor. I remember my oldest daughter, her first few steps. I was home, sitting on the sofa reading, and my daughter was playing on the carpet. She was attempting to stand, but by crawling around the furniture. She would kind of crawl her way up the furniture, probably happened in your families as well, and gripping whatever was available. And I really wasn't too concerned because she couldn't really walk. She could just crawl around and climb, but she couldn't really walk yet. And I'm busy reading my magazine, and I didn't really pay close attention. And I looked up, and I was horrified. My beloved little 10-month-old daughter was standing, actually balancing on the top of a large toy, a plastic train, the kind that has wheels and rolls around easily. It was clear that she had no idea that disaster was imminent. You see, one tiny move and she would crash to the floor from her high perch. She felt perfectly safe. She wasn't a bit worried. After all, her daddy was there, and she thought it was so exciting to be standing up on a perch surveying the world from this new perspective. So how easy then is it for a person in an argument or disagreement to be convinced in their own mind that they have the better, the higher perspective? Even though we may be right, Paul advises us to take heed lest we fall. I'm sure my daughter thought she was perfectly fine and probably wondered why Daddy managed to grab her as quickly as I could and set her gently down. Because her perspective was good. She was right in her own eyes. Another analogy the Apostle Paul used to promote conflict resolution and unity is in the letter to the Galatians, in Galatians 5:15. But if you bite and devour one another, take heed that you not be consumed of one another. Ooh, so he's using this analogy of biting and devouring. Now, they say the quality or the taste of the food is directly proportional to when you last ate. And so if you're really, really hungry, you're less fussy about what it is. And so people can get hungry and devour. And not really, they say, well, you really ate that fast. You inhaled it practically. You ate it so quickly. But when we're eating food, if we go out of our way, and if we apply that same approach to people about biting and devouring, it brings to mind a vivid example of in American history, and that is, you may have heard of the Donner Party in California, these California-bound pioneers during the gold rush, about 1850. The group got stuck in the Sierra Nevada mountains near the border of Nevada and California, just north of Lake Tahoe. And if you've ever been to the feast out in Lake Tahoe, you understand the landscape in that area, a lot of mountains. And the story is legend. The people ran out of food and they began to eat each other. We can only imagine the fear and the suspicion of each of the people that each of them had regarding the other person. Well, thinking of this, and accordingly, we shouldn't rhetorically bite or devour each other either. Nobody likes chunks taken out of them, as it were. So it would be a good time, rhetorically, if there's a disagreement, a good time to apply the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. Well, what do you suppose happens to people who become absorbed then in their pet philosophy? They're standing up on their little toy train, thinking that they have a much better perspective. What happens then when those people perhaps are church members? Paul wrote about the consequence in the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews 3:12. And he gives the scenario or a sequence of events in Hebrews 3:12. Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. Now, Paul was clear. He said that such behavior leads to an evil heart, and an evil heart leads to unbelief, and then such people depart from the living God. So it isn't all just one thing, it's a process. So now let's think about it. How many people do you know openly admit that they have an evil heart? I wasn't born yesterday, and I've never heard anybody say, yeah, I've got an evil heart. I've just never seen that or heard that. Or, yeah, I'm an unbeliever. Have you heard anybody say that? Well, you probably don't hear people because they're standing on top of that toy train thinking they're fine, and they're not going to fall. They're not an unbeliever. How many people announce that they've departed from the living God? You don't make those announcements. No, they're pretty sure that they're on firm ground because people just don't admit things like that. Most likely, they're likely to view the world from their special perspective, precariously perched on a false foundation, just like my little toddler daughter. It's more likely then that people who go down this path, they take the initiative without realizing it to exclude God from their lives. Well, then, what is the solution? Well, the solution we can read is really quite simple. It's in the book of Amos in chapter 3, verse 3, and something we've heard before in Amos 3:3. Can two walk together except they be agreed? The key then is how to come to an agreement, how to walk together. It's time to take another look at those two ladies, Euodias and Syntyche, because it's always easier to solve the problems of other people than it is to look at ourselves. But look at ourselves we must. After all, the variance between Euodias and Syntyche was recorded for us to read about. That the difference between or among brethren can take away from the precious pronouncement of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Notice that the Apostle Paul separately beseeched Euodias and Syntyche. It was up to them, the personal responsibility for each of them, to put their hearts right with God and to reconcile with each other. The three themes of the letter to the Philippians were joy and unity and humility. By having humility, they could have unity, and by having unity, they could have joy. So Paul gave us then the examples of when we should take heed. Number one, when we stand, we take heed lest we fall. Number two, we're admonished, don't bite or devour or consume each other. It's got to be a better way than chewing on somebody else. And number three, having an evil heart of unbelief, lest we depart from the living God. Well, let's flip it. How about having a good heart of belief so that we can stay close to God? Well, we have this opportunity, not just every week when we see brethren at church, but we have this opportunity every day to keep our hearts and our lives in order. And we have now just we had 4 weeks away from the feast. We can use the time wisely. The psalmist tells us the reward that for walking together in agreement, and we'll feel so good about it when we reach the Feast of Tabernacles this fall. In Psalm 133, verse 1, again, behold, how good and pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity.